Hey folks, Dave here from Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds, and I got Aaron Reed with me today. And we're going to be talking about some sci-fi, in-space, RPGs, probably some other stuff. You know, we were chatting a little bit beforehand. You've got a really interesting day job as well. You know, I could actually just spend most of the time just talking about that, to be honest with you.
Yep.
Yeah, this when we are serving Skynet, you can thank this guy. I'll leave it at that.
I'll just say you're welcome in advance.
Yeah, there you go. It'll be, yeah, sometimes I'm not sure it'll be that much different. Less corruption. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So you had a Kickstarter going on right now for a game you've been working on for a while.
That's right, yeah.
And, you know, we were talking before we got started, and this is, I think you said this is your first foray into tabletop RPGs, but you've done some other narrative-based games prior.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so let's start there. Let's start with, you know, what you're working on right now, and then we'll get into some of the backstory. You have a game on Kickstarter right now.
Yeah.
So you want to, like, kind of tell us about that? Give us the elevator pitch.
Totally, yeah. So the game is called Archives of the Sky, and the sort of shtick for it is it's a kind of GMless, diceless game with the sci-fi premise, but what it's really about is sort of using the sci-fi to put characters in situations where they have to sort of confront the sort of foundational values that they built their identity around. So this kind of stems from you know, my love for lots of classic science fiction does this in really clever ways, right? So like the original Star Trek was really famous for often using the sci-fi to talk about like issues that, you know, they wouldn't have been allowed to talk on to television at that time. You know, you see this in things like the Battlestar Galactica reboot. They touched on a lot of contemporary issues by having this like sci-fi theme around it, right? And to me, that's I love sci-fi, and that's one of the things that is really interesting about the genre, I think, is how it can take people, like recognizable people, and put them in a situation that sort of pushes them farther than we're used to people being seen along some particular axis. So my sort of, one of my intentions coming into the game was like, can we sort of replicate that core feeling in a game? So
A good portion of our audience plays D&D. They also play some other things as well, obviously. But so the idea of diceless and GMless is probably going to be a really new concept. Yeah. I have not really ventured into those territories myself either. I'm vaguely aware of them. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. It's definitely, it's like a weird little niche within a niche. And yeah, not everyone is familiar with it. So kind of like the most famous games in this space are things like Microscope. Fiasco is another one that's pretty well known. And I think where these games, this movement is like 10-ish years old is when you started seeing the first of these. There's a few before that, but it really kind of kicked up around like, you know, 2008, 2009. I think Microscope was 2011, so it's relatively new. And my theory is that this whole sort of movement is sort of a reaction against computer role-playing games in a way. So, you know, in the beginning we had D&D and stuff like that, and then we started to see computers take over some of the things that were really foundational to original D&D, like combat and, you know, movement of particular distances and rolling dice and all this stuff, right? But there are parts of role-playing that computers still suck at, right? So improvising things narrative-wise, right? You know, having dynamic reactions to stuff that weren't pre-planned. So from my perspective as a designer, I think a lot of the sort of GMless, diceless stuff is coming out of like focusing in on the stuff about role-playing that computers still can't do and building games around that. So there's a really interesting sort of spectrum you see where the more a game is sort of in this space, the less rules it has for sort of like simulating things, for tracking stats about characters, and the more rules it has for like how a story should be structured, how to allow collaboration between all participants without one of them dominating everyone else. So you sort of see the rules move from like simulating a world to simulating a story, which is really interesting to me.
So at what point, right, does it go from being a role-playing game to just a group of people sitting around telling a story?
Yeah, totally.
Where is that fine line? Or is that kind of the point? Like you're kind of getting rid of that in essence.
There definitely is a line there. I think the distinction is that a role playing game is about telling a particular story, right, within a particular constraint. So obviously, like if it's D&D, the constraint is like it's a fantasy world. Your characters have limited powers, right? Like all of these other sorts of things. So if there are too few constraints and you can just start saying anything you want and no one can challenge that or stop that, then you get into just playing make believe, right? So what these games do that's really interesting is they do have constraints, and they're either about constraints on the kind of story you can tell or constraints on the way you can use your creative powers. And what those constraints are designed to do is keep it feeling like a game, right? Rather than just like sitting around like BSing, right? So Microscope, for example, is really interesting because in that game, you're not playing a specific character. You're like collaboratively building a history together. And you sort of take turns adding basically things to this timeline that you have spread out on the table on index cards in front of you. And all the rules are sort of designed to keep an interesting succession of ideas flowing that are like revealing new things about this world you're building together. So there's a mechanic, for example, called there's a thing called a focus, where at certain points someone can point to a certain part of the history, like a war or a particular character or something, and say, okay, like this is going to be the focus now. And everything for the next round that people do has to connect in some way to that focus. And what that rule does, again, like from the perspective of a designer looking at it, is it keeps things from being too free form, right? Like it gives you a little bit of constraint, like, well, I can like make up anything I want about this history, but it somehow has to connect to like maybe this character is the focus right now. And it has a number of really smart rules like that that keep things like interesting as you're playing, but they're all kind of about targeted constraints, which is interesting.
So what do you do for conflict resolution?
Right. So in Archives of the Sky, the way that works is when you start playing, everyone builds a deck of cards together that each have a word on them. And the rules sort of encourage you to like grab any sci-fi novels you have lying around and pass them out to everyone. So you look through those for interesting kind of evocative words. You write them down one per card. And then whenever you get to a point in the game where you're not sure what's going to happen next, or you need an idea, you want to inject a little randomness, you draw a word from that card. And it's fascinating to me because humans are so good at sort of like rationalizing and justifying things that almost any time you can think of some way that word can apply to your situation, right? So like sometimes it's something really obvious, like you're like, okay, am I going to defuse this bomb or not? And you draw like explosion or fire or something like that. You're like, okay, no, I think that didn't work. But sometimes it's something that at first doesn't seem to connect, and you have to sort of really think like, okay, like, how did this word connect to that? But I would say 80% of the time, people will immediately like latch onto something and say like, oh yes, clearly what this means is that like this happens. And I like that a lot because I come from like a background of being a writer. I'm really into, like words and stuff. But it's interesting because it gives sort of like, the interpretation is flexible is one thing, which is interesting, but also the flavor it provides. Like a lot of times those word draws like totally steer the direction of the story somewhere else in a really fascinating way. There was in a couple games where like a draw from that deck at a certain point actually sort of like defined what the whole climax of the story was. And that's cool. It's one of the neat things about these games is no one knows where the story is going because there's not a game master who sort of prepared a scenario in advance. So it can be really fun to just sort of like go on this adventure and no one knows where this train is going to go, but it's going to end up somewhere. So
you're sitting down with people that have never played this game, and kind of like, how does the game start? How do you get into it? Are you taking on the role of a character, or is it more about the story itself? And then we'll jump into the chat and start pulling questions out.
Cool. Yeah. So basically the very first thing you do is that, right? You create this deck of cards, which kind of helps people get in this sci-fi headspace because all of these sci-fi words are flowing by. And then the sort of premise of the game is that it's way far in the future, like 1 million years in the future. Humanity's kind of spread out and colonized the galaxy, but very slowly, because in this world, faster than light travel or communication was never discovered. Like, it's just not possible. So at sublight speeds, people have kind of spread out and colonized the galaxy. And in that process, kind of humanity's basically taken every form imaginable, right? Like, some people have, uploaded their brains to Skynet, right? Some people have modified their physical forms into like everything you can imagine. Some people have stayed normal baseline humans. Huge galactic empires have sort of like risen and fallen and risen again over and over. But there are these certain people who sort of basically decided to stay outside of all the civilization. So they basically are just wanderers, right? So they go on these like long, centuries long voyages when they're in hibernation between star systems, arrive, sort of like see what's happening and move on. They sort of like don't become part of any of these societies. And because of that, they've developed this really unique perspective on what humanity is, basically, because they've seen it in all its variations. So when you start the game, you build the deck of words, you make a house, which is sort of like a group of these wanderers with a core mission. And that mission might be something like, we protect life. It might be something like we hunt all the wild creatures in the galaxy. It could be we preach, we terraform, right? Like, it's kind of whatever you want. But you sort of come up with their core mission, and then you define some sort of core tenets that everyone in that house believes in, right? So if it's like we protect people, you might have a tenet that's something like we will never draw first blood or something, right? And then what you do is each person creates a character who's a person in that house, and you come up with a core tenet that your individual character has. And kind of what the game then does is it's designed to help you sort of discover situations where maybe somebody's personal core tenet in a particular scenario would come into conflict with one of the house tenets. And then you have to sort of figure out how does that get resolved. But it can be any two values, which is kind of interesting. So it could be two personal values between two different people, which then sort of becomes a story like about a conflict between those two characters. It could even be two personal values of the same character, which then, obviously makes it a thing sort of about like an internal contradiction and how this person's, friends and fellow travelers help them resolve that. But that's kind of the core of the game is you build a house, you build characters, and then the rules sort of help you improvise your way towards a story that puts something into conflict there.
Okay. So one of the questions in the chat from Dom is this sci-fi or science fantasy? And one of the things that he says, I really have a problem RPing a character that is smarter than I am, and I think everyone does. So,
yeah, it depends a little on how you want to play it. So there's not like a lot of stats in the game. So there's no sort of like enforced, this is how lasers work or anything like that. You can sort of play it hard sciencey if you have a group of people who enjoy that, right? But you're sort of not required to. And typically, especially when people are sort of like improvising stuff off the cuff, it tends to get more on the science fantasy side, right? Like people play a little fast and loose with how physics works and things like that. But yeah, it can really, I think, work in either. And that's another thing, like to the comment about like playing characters smarter than you, because you don't have stats in the traditional sense, you're thinking more about one of the reason the game science fiction is that it's the stories it makes are really more about whether somebody should do something, not whether they could. So it's sort of assumed that your characters are like competent at anything they want to put their hands to, right? But the real heart of it is like whether they actually should do this thing that they're capable of doing.
And I guess too, you're also going to define what type of character you want to play as you're going along. So you're then constrained by whatever rules you set for yourself. Yeah,
for sure. It really can kind of flexibly adapt itself to individual play styles pretty well.
So the Mighty House wants to know how is it like Fiasco, or if it is.
Right. Yeah. So Fiasco. So actually, this is kind of interesting. One of my sort of motivations going into this was to I had noticed something about a lot of GMless games, which is that a lot of them tend to have a trade-off between having someone who's sort of in charge of pushing the story forward, or everyone playing their own character. And it seems like part of what came out of this was that it's actually hard to do both of those things at once, right? To think about playing your character and what your character would be doing, but also think about like the bigger picture of where the story is going and like how are we moving towards a climax or whatever, right? So Fiasco, for example, everyone's playing their own character, but no one's really focused on, is this story going anywhere or being coherent? So I love Fiasco, and every time I play it, I have a ton of fun. But the stories it produces tend to be really incoherent because you're bouncing each person's scene. They're thinking about like their own motivations and what they want. There's not any sort of rules or mechanics that are sort of forcing you to try to like stay coherent or connect. Well, there's a lot of connections to other characters, but the stories tend to really sort of like ramble and not resolve in as satisfying a way as I want. And there's another really interesting game in this space called Lovecraft-esque that where you have a shared character. So there's a single player character and you take turns playing them. But when it's not your turn playing the character, the rules are sort of having you think about other things, like build creepy events that are happening to that character, sort of think about, like the mystery that they're uncovering and like what the solution might be. So one of the things I was interested in seeing is, could you have a game like this where you are playing a specific character? Because that's kind of one of the aspects of like traditional role-playing games I really wanted to preserve, right? But where you also didn't have one person sort of guiding the story and pushing it forward. So a lot of the rules sort of came out of this notion of, are there ways of sort of like splitting that cognitive load so that there are moments at which you can think about your character and moments at which you're thinking about other things. And in earlier versions of the game, that didn't work as well. So people would get really overloaded because they were basically being asked to do too much at once, right? So I did a lot of like tweaking through playtesting to try to figure out ways of sort of, thinking about certain things at certain times, basically.
So there's a personal deck that you build at the beginning of the game, but there's also like a world deck too. Is that correct?
No, it's just one. So you have the deck of words. You have I think the values is what you're thinking of. So you have the deck of words. You also have values for your house that are shared between everyone, and then personal values that are just your own. And then at certain points in play, people can essentially like play moves. So there's a thing called threatening a value, which is where something has come up in a scene that you think ties into a value. So maybe someone has a value. So maybe you've sort of decided that in this galaxy there's humans, but there's also these aliens called the Grebulons, right? So maybe someone has made up a personal value that's like, I'll never forgive the Grebulons for what they did to me, right? So somebody else then later on might play a scene where like a Grebulon shows up and is looking for help. And the person who sort of had that idea might sort of go like, oh, and they might like take a token and threaten the I hate Grebulons value of the other person, which is sort of a way of saying like, oh, like maybe this is going to come up in the story. Like maybe we should all be thinking about where this might be going. And then later on, as you sort of get towards the climax of the game, you'll actually take two values that have been threatened and sort of move them in the center of the table together, because these two values have now sort of become like the crux of this episode you're telling, right? Like one of these is going to win out over the other, basically. I have an example. Actually, I guess the Grebulons example is a reskin of this. I have an example on the website, I think, of like Kirk in the early Star Trek movies, right? Has this like, I'll never forgive Klingons for the death of my son. But then he also is, a believer in the Federation and diplomacy and making peace and everything. So we can see, when he says that line, I'll never forgive Klingons for the death of my son, we immediately think like, oh, like he's going to, later on in this movie, like he's going to have to, that's going to be put to the test, right? He's going to have to choose whether that's more important to him than, his loyalty to the Federation. So
looking at some of the gameplay photos, the game looks very chaotic. The table, it looks very chaotic anyway. There's just like a bunch of pieces of papers and tents, and I guess that's where your tenants are and stuff like that. So essentially, like you build the deck of words that people are going to use, and you kind of you each have your tenants. You have the house tenant. So where would a game go from there? Like if you could give us like an example of play,
right?
Or even share stories from the tables you've played at.
Yeah, totally. So one of the other things you do right at the start is to to sort of like get kind of seed a bit of a world, so you have things to play off of, is once you sort of know who your house is and what their role is, you create 3 sort of other large scale entities. So these might be other houses. They might be sort of like,
your Grebulons.
Civilizations. Yeah, right. Like the Grebulons. So you create an ally, which is another big group that supports your house, an opponent, which is a group that doesn't, and then a mystery, which is something new that has sort of arrived on the scene of the galaxy that you're not really sure what it is or where its loyalties lie or whatever. And that's sort of like just enough world building, essentially, that when you start playing, you can be like, oh, well, what's an idea? Well, maybe our ally like calls us up and like has a mission for us, or maybe we've received reports that like our opponent is doing something threatening and we need to go investigate. So that sort of gives you a little like creative juice to get going. And then the sort of main structure of the game is that you go around taking turns, sort of setting up a scene. So when it's your turn, you come up with a question, which is basically like the thing you're most interested in figuring out what happens next. So you might have just learned that, like maybe the Grebulons are attacking your ally somewhere. So you're like, okay, the question for this next scene is going to be like, what do we find when we arrive at this system that we heard the Grebulons were attacking? You sort of then, you set up the scene, you decide like who's going to be in the scene, where it's going to take place. So maybe in that case, it's going to be all of us and it's going to be on the bridge of our ship. And then you basically just sort of start role-playing as your characters. But the one difference is that everyone sort of has GM powers to make things happen in the world. So if you say, well, okay, we arrive and I scan the system, see what happens. You could just make up what you find, or you could draw from the trove and say like, okay, I'm just going to draw and we'll see what happens. Right. But this is where it gets a lot more sort of like improv games, right? Because everyone's sort of like in control. There's this sort of like yes and mentality, right? Of like, if someone says something, like even if you were thinking things were going in a different direction, you're just like, nope, okay, we're going to roll with that. We'll see where that goes. And you sort of play the scene until either you've sort of answered the question that you started with the scene, or you've sort of explored it in an interesting way. Maybe you've like actually realized there's a deeper question underneath that. Maybe it seems like it's going to take longer to figure it out. And then someone can say cut to end the scene. And then there's kind of a few other things that go on, but that's essentially kind of the core, is going through this series of scenes and in each one asking like the question that the person whose turn it is sort of like most wants to know next about the plot.
So how much has gone into the playtesting?
Yeah, a lot. It sort of surprised me coming into this, or coming out of it rather, how much playtesting this really required to get right. Probably because I come from a background of doing digital games, where you definitely do a lot of playtesting, but the vast majority of your time is spent sort of like coding and implementing the ideas you get from that, right? In tabletop, it's sort of like the reverse, right? Like most of your time is spent playtesting. And after a couple of playtests, right, like 8 hours of playtests, you'll be like, okay, like, yeah, I think this rule needs to be changed. And you'll spend an hour or two like tweaking that rule. And then you go back and playtest again, right? So, but what was interesting to me is how many iterations that took for the game to really, polish. When I had a first pass of the rules and I first sit down to playtest, I was like, okay, well, this probably will need a little work, but, we'll see what happens. Almost none, like the game now is almost entirely different from that first version. Like every single part of it has changed multiple times since then. So it definitely took a lot of iteration. I think I went through 20 sort of like major revisions where it wasn't just like fixing a typo or tweaking something. It was like a whole new rule, taking out a whole system, adding in a whole other system. So this was, always in the back burner. I was never sort of doing it full time, but it was like over a year and a half that I've been sort of like working on this and tweaking it. So it took a while to arrive in its final form.
So games like this are very, very rules light. So sometimes I think it's actually harder to play test and stress test your rules when there's so few. Because I'm like, just from listening to you talk, and I'm speaking from mostly ignorance here, but I'm like, it sounds like there's maybe like 5 rules to the game. So like, but that being said, the less rules you have, that means they have to really, really work.
Right. Yeah. And like we were saying earlier, right, like there's kind of a line where if you go past that line, it doesn't really feel like a game anymore. People don't have enough structure to really participate. Um, so so the rules that are there are sort of like very specifically designed to, um, you know, help to enable people to tell these kinds of stories, right? And there's a lot of really subtle things, and I think this is true of any game, right? When you really dig into like why it works the way it does. But just things like there's a mechanic called reflection, which is at the end of a scene, everyone sort of says one thing that they're thinking about where the plot might be going. So like you know, man, like I wonder if the Grebulons are in league with like the Machine Empire, right? And that's sort of an out of character thing that just sort of like gives ideas to everyone else. But the order you do that and the direction like you go around and do that in is specifically designed to help the next narrator be ready to do a scene, because they go last basically. So they get to hear everyone else like speculate on where the plot is going before they start a scene basically. And so you're deliberately going like clockwise rather than counterclockwise to enable that. So there's a lot of like very minor things like that were that are sort of specifically to help encourage certain kinds of behavior or help, you know, get people to focus on certain things at certain times. There's a lot of in really heavy improv stuff like this, a lot of rules in multiple games, not just mine, that are about sort of like giving people permission to do certain kinds of things. Because a lot of times people will be really hesitant to, especially to contradict other players, right? That's something that's really difficult to convince people that they have the authority to do. So if you want to have the ability to do that in your game, you really need to like signpost that that's allowed. You really need to maybe have like, there's a thing you see in a lot of these games that's sometimes called like a ritual phrase, which is like a specific set of words you say that the rules say, when you say this, this happens, right? And that's sort of like a psychological way of knowing that like, if I say these words, it's okay to do this thing that might be socially awkward because the rules told me that I could, right? So there's a lot of really interesting structural things that go on to enable the kind of like experience you want to happen.
Well, there's also an area where you can contradict other players without saying they're wrong too,
Right, yeah.
and some people don't get that nuance as well, I imagine, you know, because you could add to the story by contradicting another player because you introduce a new piece of information that wasn't there before. Do you give like examples like that?
Right. Yeah, and Archives actually has very little contradiction in the final version. So there were actually rules in the earlier version that basically let you think like, well, no, like I really want this to happen, so I'm going to do this to allow that to happen. And I ended up taking those out mostly because people never used them in practice. Like there were just not enough situations where someone actually needed to invoke that, right? Like usually people are like, yeah, sure, like that thing is totally different than what I was planning, but yeah, let's go with it. So, but there's a really interesting game called Polaris, and there's a newer role-playing game called Polaris. This is one from I think 2004 by a guy named Ben Lehman. That is very built around these ritual phrases. And essentially you almost have this negotiation using these phrases about what's going to end up happening to your character. So in that game, the person you're sitting across from this is also a GMless game. The person you're sitting across from, their role is always to like make the worst possible thing happen to your character. So whenever your character is doing things or saying things, they're thinking about like, what would make this bad? What would be the worst thing that could happen? Maybe like, this person who we thought was dead is going to show up, who has a tragic past with, right? Like they're always sort of complicating things for you. But you have these series of phrases you can say to either sort of escalate or de-escalate that, where you're essentially negotiating, saying like, okay, I'm going to get what I want in the scene, but you're going to have to pay this like terrible price for it. So you can sort of make that work, but you sort of need rules to make it work, right? Otherwise, you're just arguing essentially. So
well, yeah. Sometimes that's role-playing games too. So Anthony wants to know, the implied setting is spacefaring non-Earth, but is there anything stopping one from creating a more limited setting, Earthbound Cyberpunk? No, Aaron will show up at your house and be like, nope, can't do it that way.
I will enforce.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. So there's a couple things about the setting, again, and this is sort of like psychology, right? That enforces the kind of stories the game is supposed to be about. So the thing about there's no faster than light travel seems like a minor detail, but it's actually really important, because this whole idea of being forced to confront this contradiction in your values basically only works if you can't appeal to a higher authority, right? So if you're all cops and some situation comes up and you can just call in like your chief and say like, what should we do? Then this sort of core notion of the game breaks down, right? So, and this is why in Star Trek sometimes they can have live real-time consultations with people back at Starfleet, and sometimes they're like 4 weeks away, and it's not particularly scientifically rational why sometimes it works one way or the other. But the reason is that in certain episodes they can't ask the Federation what they should do, because it's about, you know, how they deal with the situation on their own, right? So that's one of the things that if you're going to like port it to another setting, you need to think about, is the characters need to be in a situation where they're isolated from everyone else in their group, right, their organization. Another thing, like I said earlier, the Sci-Fi does is it sort of gives people permission in a weird way to get into sort of interesting like moral and ethical dilemmas. There was a game once where people, or one of the, I think this was the Ally, they decided there was this group of like uplifted animals that had been, they were like human animals, but they'd been genetically engineered to be like intelligent and all of this stuff. And they were called the Moravians, after like the island of Dr. Moreau, which I thought was a really great name. And they ended up being involved in this story that where they were sort of taking the side of these, what was happening? It was something like there was this alien like fungus or something that people didn't know whether they're actually alive or not. And there was going to be, something was going to happen that was going to wipe them all out. Like a huge like bomb was going to go off. And someone ended up narrating the scene where a Moravian ambassador came in and like passionately argued that you couldn't wipe these creatures out because, you know, like them, they were something that didn't used to be considered human, but now was, right? So it became this whole debate then about like, you know, the ethics of, you know, like what kind of life is precious and everything. And that's the kind of thing that if you were doing a game that was like, you know, set in contemporary New York with a bunch of, you know, whatever, like just something in modern times, it probably wouldn't be as easy to get into that kind of discussion, right? Because it would seem sort of like awkward or whatever. But Sci-Fi sort of gives you this excuse to like go on these weird philosophy head trips and stuff. So the book that I'm kickstarting actually has several alternate settings in it. So one of them is sort of like a Wild West thing where you're a group of like, you know, like a posse enforcing a law out in the middle of nowhere. So you definitely can do it in other settings, but there are a couple things, and the book sort of like tells you the key things you need to preserve that really make the story work the way it does.
Yeah, that was actually kind of my next question, is like how much of it is, you know, setting specific, you know, how much of it is about rules and just like the theme and flavor of the game. But to me, it does seem like you said, if you preserve certain things, you can kind of play it anywhere, because you even stated like empires have risen and fallen. Some people have settled. Some people are basically on these arcs still looking for a place, you know. But I guess you said like the idea is most of the actual players in the game are the ones that are still out wandering.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've never played it this way, but a couple people have said that like a post-apocalyptic setting would be really great for this. And I think that'd be pretty cool, right? Like, in that case, there is no authority to appeal to, right? Because the authority's collapsed. So you have to figure it out yourself. Another one of those things that this is kind of tying into that same issue. You can't sort of have a structure where there's a leader. So if you're, I think you could like sort of do Star Trek with this, but you couldn't have someone as the captain, because again, it's the same thing, right? Like if the characters can all turn to one character and say like, well, you're the captain or you're the squad leader or whatever, like you make the decision. That doesn't work. It has to be something that everyone collaboratively has to sort of like find a way to resolve. So yeah, there's I think 3 or 4 of these sort of little things that you need to sort of preserve the way the game works. But with enough creativity, you can sort of, you know, make that work in a wide variety of settings. So
have you encountered anything more interesting than the Moravians?
Man, what else has happened? There's been a lot of there tends to be a lot of dramatic like, so the sci-fi really also pushes you to like up the stakes on things, and there's actually specifically a rule in the game that sort of makes this happen. But the end result of this is often like a sun exploding or something like that. So like this is sort of like the if you keep upping the stakes, eventually that's where you get to. So a lot of games have ended with like, you know, supernova caused by someone involved in the story, which is pretty exciting. One of my friends actually, I think I actually ended up putting this in the Kickstarter video because this was sort of a running joke among my like local game groups. It's like, oh, Archives of the Sky, it's the game where you blow up the sun. Yeah, what other kinds of stories have come out?
What about reoccurring themes? Have there been reoccurring themes that you weren't expecting?
Yeah. So it's interesting how people. One of the values. So you create a couple values for your house, but the rules speculate that one of them always must be, we must always remain human, and that's in there specifically because it's really vague, and it's really great at producing these interesting conflicts between characters who have different definitions of what that means. So I think the Moravians thing evolved out of that, right? Like someone had threatened that value, and then that's where the sort of story went. But it's really interesting to see the different things people latch onto in the context of playing their characters, right? As like a hill that they're going to die in about, like, this is the line that means you're not human anymore, right? Is that you look like human? Is that you haven't modified your intelligence? Is that, you know, you can still feel emotions or something, right? Like what is the thing that is that core kernel for your character that you've created in this world, right? But also sort of by extension, right, for the people at the table. I think, yeah, and it's interesting that might, yeah, I don't know if like that would be the core question of sci-fi produced like in any era. Like that might be something that's like kind of particular to the weird moment we're at now with lots of, you know, displacement of jobs and computers doing more and more things that we used to think of as things only people could do. But that's a thing that comes up a lot. Yeah, it's endlessly fascinating to me how creative people are, right? Like when I first started playtesting this, I was really worried that people would get blocked, that people would like get sullen and not participate because they felt too on the spot or they couldn't think of ideas. But you know, like I've playtested this with people who've never role-played before. I've playtested it a lot with people who've never done like GMless games before. And almost universally people like step up and start coming up with amazing ideas, which is super inspiring to me. I think people are better at that than they give themselves credit for, generally speaking.
So that makes me kind of wonder, like I've played with a lot of different people over the years, and I'm sure you have as well. You always run into certain players that are kind of there, and it's almost like a body filling a space at times. Do you feel like a game like this really helps with that and kind of like pulling them into the game because they can't really hide behind dice and mechanics?
I think so, yeah. So like in a normal role-playing game, there's often really like nothing that's forcing you to contribute, right? Like you can just kind of be a member of the party who never does anything, right? Like, yeah. So unless your GM is doing a good job at like trying to like, you know, make sure everyone's participating and stuff, there's nothing in the rules that really force you to like step up and participate. Archives and some other story games have things that are sort of specifically designed to allow everyone to participate equally. So in Microscope, for instance, there's a really interesting thing where when it's your turn, no one is allowed to give you ideas, even if you ask for them, which at first seems really weird and like harsh, right? Like, well, what if I just want some ideas? But it's specifically designed that way because if you know that you can't ask for help and you just have to roll with whatever you say, some of those shyer people will start like pulling out stuff that they never would have done if they knew that someone else could have done it for them, right? So that rule, and I've seen that work several times with people who like were like a little shy to participate. If you're sort of forced to, you start doing it, and then you're like, oh wow, this is fun, and no one like stopped me, so I'm going to keep doing it, right? So that's cool. Yeah. Now, yeah, go ahead.
So we've talked about the game a lot. I would like to like go into like what you do for kind of like a day job a little bit, if you don't mind, just because it's really interesting. Sure. So, so although this is your first tabletop RPG, you were doing other kinds of games, before this.
Right.
So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So my first released game was, I think, in 2003, and was a text adventure called Gourmet, where you played a chef who got in a fight with a lobster. And ever since then, I've been making weird indie games, usually in kind of like 1 or 2 person teams, mostly for fun, but then it sort of ended up being a career path, basically. So I did a lot of stuff in the text adventure world. I accidentally ended up writing what was at the time the longest text adventure that had ever been written, which I did not intend when I started out that project, but that's where it ended up. And then I ended up going to graduate school on the strength of some of my games to study interactive narrative in general. And specifically, one of the things I've really always been interested in is what are different kinds of ways that the player's input can become part of a digital interactive story, right? So obviously that's something that's super foundational to tabletop role-playing games. But in computer games, we still see like pretty basic technology for that, right? Like dialogue trees where you pick from one of 3 options. And usually those 3 options don't actually have much of an impact on what's happening, right? So I've really been interested in like what are different ways that interactive stories can be structured such that player input can actually matter more. So in the last 6 or 7 years, I guess, I've done a series of kind of experimental indie games exploring different ways of looking at that. So the last time I did a Kickstarter, it was for a digital game called the Icebound Concordance that involved a physical printed book that you used to sort of alter the way a digital game story was going. So this was sort of like the early days of augmented reality. And you'd actually sort of like hold pages from this book up to the camera, and this character in the game would respond to that. And then based on what pages you chose to show him, it would sort of change things about how the story was progressing. So I've done a lot of things like that over the years. And now I'm sort of working at a place that lets me use those skills in a different way, which is interesting.
That's fascinating. The whole the actual combining the book, almost choose choose your adventure path with the technology, and is that where that kind of came from? Because that's what I think of right away. Because I remember when I was a kid, reading those books, and you get to the fork, and you have to choose something and go to the page.
Yeah, I think there's definitely like something really magical about printed books that it's been really interesting watching the ebook, right? Because the ebook had like this meteoric rise, and for a few years it looked like it was going to really like replace paper books. And then I think since about, I don't know this exactly, but I think since about 2013 or 2014, ebooks have actually like been on a sort of steady decline, and print book sales have risen again because like the tangibility of a physical book is really interesting. And especially in the space of digital games where nothing is tangible anymore, right? Like everything is digital downloads. It's a really different sensation to be playing a digital game while you're actually like thumbing through a real thing in front of you, right? So it sort of blurs this line of like, when are we, like, where are the boundaries of this game, right?
Yeah. I really struggle to read anything that is like an e-reader. Like there's something to be said for just like the tactileness of having a book in your hands. Now, my youngest brother, on the other hand, is like, I just like the fact that I don't have to store books anywheres, and I can just, I have like just this one thing where it's like it's only this big and everything is right there, and I don't have to have bookshelves and things like that.
Well, yeah, and for this game, a lot of the sort of ideas from it came out of like asking ourselves, like, what are the things that digital books do well, and what are the things that printed books do well, right? So not really sort of like making a value judgment, but like how could you actually build something where those two things are working together and they're each using like their own individual strengths, right? So in a digital book, obviously one of the advantages is like it can change, right? Like it doesn't, it's not a static thing, right? So anyway, so that was a lot of the interplay between those two things came out of those like early thoughts. So,
Carrie in the chat says pretty much the same thing. This is why my brother feels that way too. Is after moving twice a year, I've gone PDF only, and that is a huge thing. If you kind of if you have to have nomad tendencies.
Yeah, the next time I move, I'm gonna be really sad because I've acquired a lot of heavy books since I moved last. So
yeah, and that's like the conundrum.
Yep.
So are you when the game comes out? Are there going to be cards? Because I know one of the things you wanted to do is put your is have the inspiration kind of already baked into it, if in case you don't want to just have a bunch of books all over the place to pull your sci-fi words from.
Totally, yeah. I thought about doing sort of like a deck of cards thing. I ultimately decided not to because I wanted to keep the Kickstarter like really simple. But one of the things that the book has is a big table of good words. So there'll be sort of a mechanism where you can just sort of use that table to like, jot some things down. And you can totally do that in advance too. So there's a bit in there too about sort of doing like a quicker version of the game if you only have like a couple hours or if you're at a con or something. And one of the things that recommends you do is sort of like pre-prepare that deck. I think the ideal experience though is everyone creating it themselves at the start of the game, because it really sort of immediately gets you into this headspace of like everyone is contributing and like no one knows what's going to happen, right? These weren't predetermined words. These were words that I just randomly found in this copy of like Foundation, right?
Well, it's almost like a session zero baked into the game itself, where everyone's collaborating together to come up with the world.
Yeah. But yeah, I do also, this was actually, I did get that exact comment from one of the first playtests that I didn't run myself. Someone did it at a con and they were like, yeah, the game, worked well. Everyone had a good time. But I was really annoyed that I had to lug these 8 heavy sci-fi novels to the convention and in my hotel room and backpack and everything. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes that's not ideal.
Go figure. So is this the game? Like, are you going to continue with tabletop RPGs and making more games, or are you going to continue with this game, expanding upon it? Do you know what the future holds for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't. So definitely, I think a bit of my passion has shifted back to tabletop in the last year or two, and this might be sort of a natural outgrowth of going to grad school and something is starting to like yearn to be spending your time on other things. So a couple years ago, I really, I'd essentially never stopped tabletop role playing my whole life, but I hadn't been doing it as much, and I really got back into it heavily 3 or 4 years ago, in part to sort of get away from computer screens, right, and coding things and all of the frustrations that go with making digital games. So yeah, this game came out of that. I've really, I've been going to a lot of cons, like playtesting this game, but that's really like right at the moment where my creative passion lies. So I wouldn't be surprised if my next game was also a tabletop game. But I am still really interested in this sort of like space of overlap between the two, right? So definitely not in the sense of like, like let's replace the game master with a computer, but more in the notion of like what are like new kinds of play experiences we haven't invented yet that could be created by having both computers doing interesting things and humans sitting around a table doing interesting things.
There's at least 2. Actually, I believe there's 2 Kickstarters going on right now that are kind of overlap each other that involved AR. For tabletop games, for specifically fantasy games, where it's like you get cards or targets and you put them on the table, and then you look through a viewer or your phone, or and it's got there's a monster there's a dragon, or there's a house, or
right. Yeah.
So there's definitely, it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, I'd be really interested in doing something in that space too.
We talk to a lot of creators on here, and sometimes someone is like, "Yep, this is the game I want to make, and I'm just going to keep building this game out for others are like, no, I'm a game designer at my heart, and I just want to design games. So I could never, even my own games, I can't even stay true to them. I just want to make something new. So I'm just always curious to see where people are thinking and what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to, I tend to work on, I guess this game is no exception. I tend to work on projects that take like a long time to finish. Like most of my games were things that were like 2 or 3 year projects. And I always, I think as a designer, it's much better to do a lot of smaller things because then you're like iterating faster and learning more and all this kind of stuff. But I'm terrible at following that advice myself. Like I just tend to gravitate towards like these huge epic projects. And Archives is definitely not epic in that sense, right? Like the book is going to be like, 80 or 100 pages long. It's pretty straightforward. But the process of creating it, like I was saying earlier, right, was something that really took a lot of refinement and iteration to get right.
I've just met you, but just from talking to you, like it seems like you have a day job that's pretty fulfilling, right? But most people can't say that, right? So they are more inclined to probably pour their efforts elsewhere, where they're just like, this is a page, I gotta go do a thing. But from talking to you, you have a really interesting day job where it sounds like you do that because you want to do that. Not because you were like, oh, I think this will be a lucrative career or this is going to put food on the table.
Right.
So, so that would divide your attention for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've kind of been in like both situations, right? So like when I was working on my epic text adventure game, for a while, I was working at a call center. After that, I was doing sort of like banner ad graphic design stuff. So it wasn't very and bad banner ads, right? Not like good ones. So it wasn't creatively fulfilling at all. So when I was in that scenario, I would come home and really like pour myself into the writing because like it was my chance to be creative. It's interesting. So being in grad school, you're being creative or asked to think, originally and use your brain all the time. So it was really different to come home from that and then continue being creative, right? Like keep the brain working a lot. And in since I've been in that scenario, it's actually harder in a lot of ways to come home and convince myself to keep working rather than just like watch Netflix or whatever, right? Because like I feel like my brain wants to rest now.
At some point, you need to refill the cup.
Yeah, right. But it's been interesting being in both of those situations. And I guess something I've learned about myself is I will keep making stuff in both of those situations. So I guess that's good. But yeah, I definitely had some burnout moments in grad school where I sort of had hit, like you said, like the cup was totally empty. Like I had nothing. So it took a while to recharge. But
I guess that kind of the point I was getting at too is it makes it easier for you to invest in these long-term projects. When you have something you're doing during the day that kind of is fulfilling that need, and you're being creative and you're enjoying, as opposed to just trying to churn something new out and being innovative all the time. You can kind of like settle into it and kind of just like really enjoy the process.
Yeah, I think there's a thing too where in a long project it gets kind of cozy, right? Like you enjoy being in the space of working on that particular project. Whereas if you're someone who like makes a new thing every month, you don't have that same level of like familiarity with it. There's definitely a lot of developers that I've met who I think, like you were saying, like, right, there's some people who's like, this is the one game that I'm going to spend my whole life perfecting, right? Like Dwarf Fortress is a digital game. That's, I think, a great example of that, right? It's like, a game that has been being worked on for more than a decade, and the plan is for, the designer to keep work on it for another few decades, right? So, so it's nice to sort of have that home, right, where you're going to go and you're going to do your creative stuff. But I guess I tend to, after a year or two, be like, okay, I think we're ready to move on to the next thing. But
so you'd mentioned cons. Do you have any cons coming up that you're going to?
The one I'm excited about right now. So there's a Bay Area con, KublaCon. That's the weekend after this one. So that's the next thing I'll be at, and that's a pretty big con for here. That's it's I think it's like 600 or 700 people, so it's pretty good sized for a local con. And then the one I'm really excited about is I think it's in July, in Seattle. There is a con that's very specifically sort of like story games focused meetup. It's called Go Play Northwest. And it's lots of people who actually make like GMless games, like sort of live in that area and attend that frequently. And a lot of the games played are this kind of thing. So I'm really excited to head up to that. It'll be my first time going to that one, so that should be fun.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm kind of curious as to what kind of turnout you get, because we were talking about like a niche within a niche within a niche.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's been running several years and apparently is doing pretty well. That was actually where at last year's Go Play Northwest was the first time that it was play tested by someone other than me. So that was cool.
Nice. So when you're at a con, you're gonna be there running games, hanging out, or boothing?
Not boothing. I've done a lot of that for indie games, and it's not fun. It's just like, it's not fun. What I'm hoping is that, actually, this is kind of part of the reason why I'm doing this as like a book and trying to get some publicity about it, is because I would like it to be a thing that starts, showing up on bookshelves rather than me like schlepping a suitcase full of them around the country. We still have a bunch of those Icebound books in our garage right now, for example. So when you're doing something all yourself and selling it yourself and everything, it's a whole thing you have to deal with. So for this, like, it's going to be print on demand through Drive-Thru RPG, so I won't have to deal with any of that. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, I mean, mostly I go to cons to play. Like, as many sessions as I can fit time into, I play stuff. I usually will run, the last couple of years I've been running like archives playtests, and I usually run some other random game I've wanted to play. I like running games a lot. Like I tended to be the GM in my group, because I was the one who had the motivation to get everyone together and play something.
Is that why you came up with is that why you found GMless Games?
Kind of. So, there's an interesting like change in the role of creativity there. Yeah, I think like you can sort of argue that maybe I was sick of always being the one to come up with the plot. So I was like, let's play these games, and you guys can pull some of the weight too. I just sometimes in cons it's hard to get into games. So if you run a couple, like at least you're going to get into those. So that's nice. But yeah, like I just, every session try to play something and try new things and stuff. So
cool. Do you have a regular gaming group now?
Yeah, I do. I was telling you this before the show started. So for the last couple of years, I had a few people locally who were either connected to this program or just interested in games generally. We were doing a pretty regular thing where we were meeting up and playing kind of indie experimental one-shots. So we did a lot of GMless games. We did a lot of, kind of weird offbeat stuff. But about 6 or 7 months ago, we went back to D&D because we wanted something more familiar and comforting. So I actually, it was kind of funny. In typically epic Aaron Reed fashion, there were way too many players who were interested in a D&D campaign than could fit in a group. So I said, well, okay, I'll just run 2 groups within the same universe, and that'll work fine. And it actually did work fine. Like, it was a lot of fun, but there are certain logistics issues about like keeping things synced up and everything that that have become interesting. But yeah, suddenly I went to a commitment of like, okay, like I guess I'm running 2 regular D&D groups now, from no regular commitments before that. So that was interesting.
Me and Ted each play a game out of like the same town. So it's like he'll put something there, I'll destroy it, and vice versa. So we're constantly like always like kind of playing off of what the latest events are.
Yeah, pretty early on, I had a pretty awesome thing where one of the groups basically created a crime scene for the other group to investigate. The other group was like, "Yeah, what are these scorch marks on the wall from the fireball that the first group had cast?" So that was entertaining for me, at least.
Yeah, well, I forget who said it, but one of our previous guests had said, D&D is its own trope, its own genre. It's, it kind of like transcends just being a fantasy game.
Yeah.
So there's something to be said for kind of like going back to that and playing that, because you could play like a different fantasy game, but it's not necessarily going to feel the same.
Right.
So depending what you want.
Nice. I mean, like I said, the last few years I've done so many one-offs. It's just nice to go back to something where you can actually like build up stuff from session to session, right? Like build a world, build these like sort of shared, in jokes and norms, and have this whole sort of consistent world you're going back to over and over again. So that's fun too.
Absolutely. So we are coming up on the hour mark. Anything you want to leave folks with before we head on out?
Nope, I don't think so. Yeah, you can find Archives of the Sky on Kickstarter. You can get PDF for $10 or the printed book. There's a couple. There's a higher tier reward where I will run a game of Archives for you via Skype for your group. I think there's 3 of those left. It's a limited one, so jump on that if you're interested. And yeah, it's been great to be on the show. Thanks for having me on.
You're quite welcome. As always, folks, the links are in the description, so you can find them there for your convenience. Thanks for coming on, Aaron, and thanks for everyone for hanging out with us. And until next time, stay nerdy.